So, uh, we've gotten off to a great start. Slightly delayed, but we're getting there. Good afternoon to everyone from New York. Good morning to colleagues in Australia and the Pacific, and welcome to this 19th Conference of State Parties, COSP19 side event, Deinstitutionalisation of People with Disabilities, 20 Years of the CRPD, from Rights on Paper to Community-Based Reality. And I can see Shelley coming in just now into the meeting, which is great. My name is Tim Hart. I am joining today as facilitator, and I acknowledge the organisers and partners involved in bringing this event together. The Australian Federation of Disability Organisations, the Australian Disability Development Consortium, CBM Australia, Transitioning Communities for Inclusion, TCI Global, Psychiatric Survivors Association, PSA Fiji. We would like to thank the Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, for co-sponsoring this event as well. And we're very privileged in this event to elevate and provide a platform for contributions from our region and our international partners. Before we begin, a few accessibility and participation notes. This session is being delivered online with accessibility features including live otter captioning. The link, I think Amber has posted the link in the chat. So hopefully you'll be able to find the link there. We also have Auslan, Australian Sign Language Interpretation. Amber Freeman from AFDO is online to handle any accessibility issues that may arise during the event. Please message Amber in the Zoom chat or just message generally in the Zoom chat if you are having any issues with the captioning or require the link to be reposted. We obviously want this event to be as accessible as possible. Please use the chat for questions and comments if that is accessible to you. We will do our best to bring questions into the facilitated discussion later in the session. Please also feel free to identify any access needs with Amber through the chat or direct messages. Just a bit of a content note about the discussion today. Today's discussion will refer to institutionalisation, coercion, deprivation of liberty, exclusion, and rights violations experienced by persons with disabilities. We will approach these issues carefully and respectfully, centering lived experience and rights holders' leadership. Our aim today is not to treat deinstitutionalisation as a historical debate. It is to ask what meaningful implementation looks like now, 20 years after the UNCRPD was adopted, and what governments, OPDs, organisations of persons with disabilities, development partners, and civil society need to do next. We would like to acknowledge country. We would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet. Today, we recognise their continuing connection to land, water, and community and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We would also like to acknowledge people with disabilities, their families, carers, and supporters, and those individuals that have experienced or are experiencing violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. So on to speaker introductions. We have two fantastic speakers from Psychiatric Survivors Association Fiji, Amaza Hope Nadu and Sarah Osborne, and they will be covering a perspective of regional lived experience and community participation in our event. We have a fantastic speaker from TCI Global, Transitioning Communities for Inclusion Global, Pranami Tamuli. Pranami is actually joining from India at, I think it's just after 2 a.m. or around that. So thank you, Pranami, for joining so early in the morning. And Pranami will be covering deinstitutionalisation and systems transformation in practice in the discussion today. We have a fantastic speaker from CBM Australia, Alicia Carroll, and Alicia will be contributing to the discussion on research, policy, and inclusive development perspectives. And finally, we have Shelley Thompson from DFAT, from Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, providing a government perspective on international cooperation. And your facilitator today, me, I am privileged to bring this fantastic group of speakers together and I sit between the Australian Disability Development Consortium as an executive committee member there and the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations as an independent director and international coordinator at AFDO. So I'm privileged to work with these two great organisations. So a little bit on setting the scene. 20 years ago, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities gave the world a clear and transformative human rights framework. It shifted disability away from charity, welfare, and purely medical responses, and toward dignity, autonomy, equality, participation, and inclusion. The CRPD did not simply say that persons with disabilities should be protected. It said that persons with disabilities are rights holders. It said that laws, services, communities, and governments must change so that people can exercise rights on an equal basis with others. But 20 years on, the question for all of us is how far have we moved from rights on paper to rights in practice? For many people with disabilities, particularly people with psychosocial, intellectual, and cognitive disabilities, institutionalisation remains a lived reality. Sometimes that means large institutions, sometimes it means smaller residential settings that reproduce institutional control. Sometimes it means being physically in the community, but still not having choice, legal capacity, privacy, consent, support, or genuine belonging. That is why deinstitutionalisation must be understood as more than closing buildings. It is about dismantling systems that segregate, coerce, or silence people. It is about the right to choose where and with whom to live. It is about access to community-based supports, including personal assistance and peer support. It is about equal recognition before the law and supported decision-making. It is about liberty and security of person, freedom from torture and ill treatment, free and informed consent, and access to justice. In CRPD terms, this brings together multiple rights. Article 19 on living independently and being included in the community. Article 12 on legal capacity. Article 14 on liberty and security of person. Article 15 on freedom from torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Article 13 on access to justice. And Article 25D, which requires healthcare on the basis of free and informed consent. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now. So today we are asking three practical questions. First, what does institutionalization and exclusion still look like in people's lives? Second, what does rights-based community inclusion look like in practice? And third, what must states, donors, civil society, and organizations of peoples with disability, OPDs, do in the next phase of the CRPD implementation? We will begin where these conversations should always begin, with lived experience and organizations of persons with disability leadership from the region. So we will now go to our first speakers from Psychiatric Survivors Association Fiji, and I'll give a brief introduction. Our first two speakers are Sarah Anameza from PSA, Psychiatric Survivors Association Fiji, an organization led by people with psychosocial disabilities. This contribution is vital because deinstitutionalization cannot be designed from the outside. It must be grounded in lived experience, priorities, and leadership of the people most affected. I would like to invite Sarah and Ameza to reflect on what exclusion and institutionalization look like in Fiji and the Pacific, and what it means for people with psychosocial disabilities to be seen, valued, supported, and included in community life. Sarah and Ameza, please take up the microphone. You have 10 minutes. Go for it.
Okay, thank you, team. Uluvinaka, good morning, everyone. We'll jump straight into our presentation this morning. and we'll be starting off with what does institutionalization or exclusion look like for us in Fiji and the Pacific. So institutionalization and exclusion of people with psychosocial disabilities in Fiji and the Pacific are still happening today, even 20 years after the CRPD. Institutionalization does not only mean being placed in a hospital or physical institution. It can also happen in the community when people are controlled by systems, laws, attitudes, and decisions made by others. In Fiji and the Pacific, people with psychosocial disabilities are still often treated through a medical model instead of a rights-based approach. And this means they are seen mainly as people who need treatment or to be fixed or controlled, rather than as rights holders with dignity, choices, and voices. Mental health laws and other systems can still support institutionalization by allowing forced treatment, substitute decision-making, and exclusion from community life. Exclusion also happens to us because many people with psychosocial disability do not understand their rights. And also because the disability is invisible, the stigma, lack of awareness, and limited understanding of CRPD, it also makes it harder for people with psychosocial disabilities to know their rights and to use
I think
his
there might,
rights in different
Sarah,
situations.
I think there might have
Even
just been a
when
little bit of
people
a,
are invited to receive.
Sarah, I think there might be a little bit of lag on the internet. Would you mind just repeating the last 30 seconds if that's okay? And maybe just turn off your camera just for bandwidth, just so that we get slightly better audio
Okay.
quality if that's okay. Sorry.
So mental health laws and other systems can still support, institutionalization by allowing forced treatment, substitute decision-making, and exclusion from community life. Exclusion also happens because many people do not understand psychosocial disability, especially when our disability is invisible. Stigma, lack of awareness, and limited understanding of the CRPD make it harder for us to know our rights and to use these rights in different situations. Even when people are invited to sit at decision-making tables, they may not have the support, information, or recognition needed to participate meaningfully. So from us, institutionalization and exclusion are not only found in systems inside institutions, they are also found in laws, services, communities, families, and attitudes that deny people their rights, choices, legal capacity, and freedom. And this is why stronger rights-based laws, awareness, peer support, and OPD-led advocacy are needed to make real inclusion possible for people with psychosocial disabilities in Fiji and the Pacific. Now we'll talk about what are some ways people are stopped from making their own decisions, staying safe, and joining in. And I will hand the floor now to Amesa.
People with psychosocial disabilities are stopped from making their own choices, staying safe, joining in, and being listened to in many ways. Even when they live in a community, one major barrier is the institutionalized mindsets that still exist in families. Even without the building, the mindsets have that building where it becomes a barrier. It still exists in families, communities, services, and government systems. This mindset sees people with psychosocial disabilities as people who need to be controlled, protected, fixed, instead of recognizing them as right holders who can make their own decision about their own life. Another barrier is system and laws that are still in place. In some countries, mental health laws and other laws contradict disability rights, even in ours, and the CRPD. These laws still allow forced treatment, substitute decision making, exclusion from services, justice, and community life.
And Some Pacific countries have also not ratified the CRPD, which makes it harder to hold governments accountable to disability rights standard. Stigma and lack of understanding, as we mentioned earlier, are also major barriers, and many people still do not understand psychosocial disability. There is also limited knowledge of CRPD among families, community service providers, and even some people with psychosocial disabilities themselves. And this means people may not always know what their rights look like, where to use those rights, and how to speak up when their rights are denied or violated. At the OPD level, psychosocial disability-led organizations also need support to build their own understanding and capacity. When OPDs clearly understand the CRPD and how rights apply in everyday situation, they are better able to support their members, educate families and communities, challenge stigma and advocate for change. And without this support, people with psychosocial disabilities may continue to be present in the community, but still excluded from real choice, safety, participation, and voice. Now, PSA have just recently we just did a research with where we partnered with the CBM. So from the evidence, we want the government and development partners to understand that there's still a lot of work to be done. People with psychosocial disabilities are still being left behind in Fiji and the Pacific because of stigma, discriminatory laws, denial of decision makings, and limited access to appropriate services and support. Governments need to review and change their laws to make sure they are fully aligned with the CRPD and with disability rights law that exists in their different countries. Mental health laws and other laws should not allow forced treatment, institutionalization, substitute decision-making, or denial of free and informed consent. Laws should protect people's dignity, legal capacity, choices, liberty, and right to live and participate in the community. Development partners also need to understand that proper support and resources must go directly to psychosocial disability-focused OPDs. These OPDs need long-term funding, training, and capacity building so they can strengthen their organization to be able to support their members and families and advocate more effectively. Support should also include organization-to-organization peer learning with psychosocial disability movements that are more advanced. This type of peer support helped us build our own understanding. This is a work that we did with TCI Global, of understanding our own rights, which strengthened our voice, and we are now participating meaningfully at different levels. So most importantly, governments and development partners must recognize people with psychosocial disability as rights holders and leaders of change. With the right support, stigma, build capacity, and make sure people with psychosocial disability have a real voice in decisions that affect their lives. Can you tell others to stop calling me? And we'll now talk a little bit about what role do peer support and OPD-led approaches play in helping move people from inclusion to belonging.
Peer support and OPD-led approaches play a very important role in helping people with psychosocial disability move from exclusion to belonging. A strong OPD with good knowledge and understanding of rights can raise awareness, educate individuals and families, support people to understand and use their rights. Because OPDs are led by people with lived experiences, they know their members, understand their needs, and can identify practical ways to support them. OPDs are already showing good practice by changing mindsets through training, awareness, peer support, community engagement. Our work is guided by lived experiences and the CRPD, which makes our advocacy more meaningful and connected to the real lives of people with psychosocial disability. From our work, we have seen that OPD-led approaches can help people gain confidence, speak up, take part in decisions, and feel like they belong in their families and communities. However, for this work to create lasting change, OPDs need proper financial support. Long-term partnerships, short-term and one-off project funding is not enough to change deep attitudes and systems. Real change requires ongoing awareness, multiple visits, support for families and carers gaining their trust, and continued work with communities over time. OPDs need to journey with people, families, and communities for a lasting period so that inclusion, understanding, and belonging can become real and lasting.
Thank you, Mesa. Now, what CRPD rights feel most urgent in this context? Legal capacity, liberty, free and informed consent, access to justice, or living independently in the community. For us, all of these CRPD rights are urgent in this context because they are closely connected. Legal capacity, liberty, free and informed consent, access to justice, and the right to live independently in the community cannot be separated. For one right to be fully realized, the others must also be respected and protected. For example, a person cannot truly live independently in the community if their legal capacity is denied, if decisions are made for them, or if they are forced into treatment without their free and informed consent. A person also cannot access justice properly if they are not recognized as someone who has the right to make decisions or speak for themselves and be believed. From our perspective, it is difficult to prioritize only one right because people with psychosocial disabilities should not have to choose which right matters most. These are basic human rights and we should not have to beg for them. Governments must recognize that all these rights must work together if people with psychosocial disabilities are to live with dignity, freedom, choice, safety, and full inclusion in the community. And to conclude, we have one key change that Amesa will share with us to end our presentation this morning.
One key change is for governments in Fiji and Pacific to review and change their laws so they align with CRPD. Mental health laws must be stripped of parts that allow forced treatment,
Institutionalization.
and decisions to be made for people with psychosocial disability without their free and informed consent. These laws should support people's rights, choices, dignity, legal capacity, and right to live in a community. At the same time, government and developing partners must give long-term support and resources to psychosocial disability-led OPDs. OPDs are led by people with lived experiences, so they understand the real needs of their members, families, and communities. With proper funding, training, and partnership, OPTs can raise awareness, support families, challenge stigma, and help people understand their rights. This will help people with psychosocial disabilities have real voice, make their own choices, and take part meaningfully in their communities in Fiji and the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah and Ameza. What you have brought us back to is that deinstitutionalization is not an abstract policy concept. It is about whether people are seen, heard, believed, and supported to make decisions about their own lives. You have also reminded us that community inclusion does not happen automatically. It requires peer support, legal reform, services, resourcing, and shifts in attitude. I now want to widen the lens from Fiji and the Pacific experience to the global deinstitutionalization agenda, and the risk that without a rights-based approach, systems can simply reproduced institutional control in new forms. So we'll next go to our speaker from TCI Global, Pranami, representing Transforming Communities for Inclusion, TCI Global, a global network led by people with psychosocial disabilities. TCI has been central in shifting global attention towards deinstitutionalisation, legal capacity, community-based supports, and freedom from coercion. I would like to invite Pranami to help us unpack what rights-based deinstitutionalisation means in practice and what risks arise when reforms focus only on moving from one setting to another rather than transforming the systems around them. Pranami, you have 10 minutes. Go for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And I think we've established, and Sarah and Amesa have beautifully established what institutionalization is and what deinstitutionalization requires. It's not just a dismantling of buildings, but it's a dismantling of the culture of oppression, of the stripping away of rights and dignity that happens within institutions. I want to start by talking about what are the common mistakes that happen when we're talking about the practice of deinstitutionalization. So an example that we're all probably very acquainted with. There'll be a story that runs in the news cycle for a few days, talking about how some people died in an institution because there was overcrowding, there was corruption, they were denied their basic necessities, they lived in filth. There are reports of sexual violence. There are reports of, in India, for example, reports of people in institutions dying in a fire because they were chained. And all of these reports, they cause a flurry of activity. People are horrified. And the momentum builds for a point, and then it stops. It stops at the level of institutional reform, where the government or the state and people working in policy, they think what we need to do is we need to expand these institutions. We need to make sure that, there's vigilance around the corruption that's happening. We need to pay the staff well. We need to have monitoring in place and grievance redressal. These measures are not enough. There's another aspect that's gaining momentum now, which is that we're going to put people into smaller institutions in the community. We're going to relocate them into their families. There's no point in relocating people from big institutions into smaller settings or into the community or into their families if the institutional logic still prevails. So the question really is not where do we place this person, but what kind of support does this person need so that they can live a life with autonomy, that they can still make their own choices and live with dignity and lead a self-directed life. We also need to talk about the non-negotiables when we're talking about deinstitutionalization. Again, the momentum stops at a point, but it does not want to go into the sphere of legal capacity. Persons with disability, persons like myself with psychosocial disability, must be recognized as people who are capable of taking their own decisions. We must be recognized as people who can exercise their choices about where they want to live, who they want to live with, whether or not they want to take medication, what kind of treatment they would like, what kind of supports that they would like to allow them to live a dignified life within the community. One of the biggest things that happens is people do not have, especially in the government and policymakers, do not have a conceptualization of how legal capacity can be enabled in persons with psychosocial disability. It's actually quite simple. Supported decision-making is not only possible, this exists and is operationalized, has been operationalized by so many of our member OPDs across the globe. And when we're talking about supported decision making, it's about making sure that the processes that allow a system or a closed network of trusted aides and family or friends or even peer support workers or OPD social workers who can help this person, who can assist this person in working through decisions that need to be made. And it still feels very difficult for people to understand, but because I've experienced it myself, I'd like to tell you what it looks like. So if you've had a major breakup and if you've just lost your job in the same day, and you're in a tizzy, you're overwhelmed, and then you get another call for a job which requires you to relocate from this state that you're living in to another state, right? You're not going to be taking that decision on your own. You're going to be talking to your friends who know what you'd like and what your best interests are because they've worked with you, they've lived with you, they understand you. So talking through these decisions to understand what the consequences could be, what the options are, that's a very real way. And I would think about it as very respectful and compassionate brainstorming. So it is possible and it's a non-negotiable. What else is a non-negotiable in this case? The supports that are required when a person is brought into the community. So again, the alternative to institutions is not abandonment. It's not just saying that, you go and live with your families and communities, which tends to happen. It tends to happen in India, at least. There are things that a person requires to live a dignified life within the community. And these are housing, safe and accessible places to live in. We need income support. We need opportunities for livelihoods. We need protection against violence. We also need peer support networks and personal assistance. And most of all, the focus that often gets missed, we need relationships. We need to make sure that there are processes in place, that initiatives are taken so that there's awareness in these communities, so that we're not othered, so that there are actual initiatives that allow us to participate fully and feel a sense of belonging within the community and in our families. And when we talk about how do we make that happen in families, because often a lot of conflict and a lot of trauma emerges within the families, there are such amazing dialogic processes across the world. And I'd like to talk about open dialogue in Finland, for example. And so many of these practices have also been initiated by our member OPDs, which allow people to experience support back in their families. We also need to talk about what states need to do. When we talk about coercion and control, states often turn a blind eye to the fact that the medical model itself reproduces coercion and control. I think it is high time that we recognize, that states recognized violations that happen when there's no informed consent, when there's forced treatment under the guise of safety, risk aversion, protection for this person. I think it's important that states begin to question the logic underpinning these systems that assume that, there's this category of people who need to be involuntarily detained, who need to be given forced treatment and restraints. When states begin questioning that logic, I think that is when deinstitutionalization can truly, truly gain the momentum that it needs. We also need to look at what states and donors should do differently. We need to ask states to stop funding institutions, stop funding segregated settings and coercive service models, and start investing in trauma-informed and community-rooted crisis support approaches, peer support, and independent living. It's when the funding shifts that the real change happens. And with that, I'd like to end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pranami. A key message I'm hearing is that deinstitutionalisation cannot be reduced to relocation. It must be about rights, power, decision-making, and support. That leads us directly to our next contribution, how evidence, development cooperation, and the preconditions for inclusion can help build the community-based systems that make deinstitutionalisation sustainable rather than symbolic. So we will now turn to Alicia from CBM Australia. CBM's work with partners across the region has focused on disability equity and rights, including the preconditions for inclusion, support services, community-based approaches, and research on barriers to participation. Alicia, I invite you to reflect on what the evidence is telling us about the conditions needed for deinstitutionalisation to succeed, and how development cooperation can either reinforce segregation or help build inclusive community-based systems. Alicia, go for it. You've got 10 minutes.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to my colleagues from PSA and TCI Global as well. As you've heard, every moment that we delay deinstitutionalisation is a moment that we're denying people their basic human rights. The right to make daily choices with dignity and the right to be free from torture, inhumane and degrading treatment, and the right to be included in communities and to belong. Deinstitutionalisation will succeed if we build the conditions that make community life real and chosen. And the evidence from across the Asia-Pacific region and wider is very clear on what those conditions are and what happens when they are absent. CBM's research, along with our partners PSA and TCI, shows that people with psychosocial, intellectual, and cognitive disabilities are still routinely excluded from community life, and they face sustained and pervasive violations of their rights on a daily basis. Not only because they're segregated in mental health institutions, as Pranami was saying, but it's happening in households, in hospitals, in shelters, in other community settings. Institutionalisation, as we've heard, is not defined by buildings. It's defined by loss of choice, control, and autonomy. And evidence shows that institutionalisation, it's not gender neutral. Women and girls face heightened risk of violence and violations of their reproductive rights. Sexual and gender minority groups experience distinct forms of exclusion and control in institutional care. Deinstitutionalisation is, as you've heard before, about changing systems without confronting the underlying harmful norms and belief systems underpinning this and tackling the trans-institutionalisation, that movement between different forms of institutionalisation. We risk replicating the harmful systems that we're trying to replace. The barriers to participation are very consistent across contexts. We're talking about the stigma and discrimination, where people are viewed as incapable, a burden, even dangerous. These misperceptions are underpinning legal frameworks that remove legal capacity and permit detention and forced treatment. Gender-based violence, where women and girls with disabilities are particularly exposed to violence, and their silencing within institutions and households allows the violence to continue. The lack of supports, no housing support, no access to personal assistance, no peer support, and no access to non-coercive crisis response are all key barriers. Poverty and social protection plays a huge role. Families perceive that they have no other viable alternative than to use shelters. Medicalised systems that treat distress only through institutional settings and through only clinical care are a significant barrier. And critically, there's a real absence of community-based options, which creates this revolving door between institutions, hospitals, homes, and even prisons. So when these supports are missing, people are not choosing institutions. They are being forced into them because they're still there and they see them as there's no other viable option available around them. But the enablers are really clear. CBM and our partners see a range of powerful enablers for redressing the situation. There are great examples, like PSA was sharing earlier, peer support networks led by OPDs. People with lived experience are generating community-based support models. Like PSA's work under the Australian Government Regional Health Partnership Program in partnership with CBM, providing peer support spaces is really critical. Capacity building, understanding and awareness of rights and ability to identify violations is really critical. And CBM's using evidence-based approaches like the World Health Organization Quality Rights Initiative. It's really powerful, along with bridge training. So understanding what the CRPD says about our rights. And supported decision-making is a core foundation in all of those efforts. Non-coercive approaches to crisis support is really critical, and these community network building and circles of support are all evidence-based approaches to providing support in communities and are alternative to institutions. Supporting people to have access to basic housing and livelihoods. Our partner Koshish in Nepal are providing crisis support to families and trying to intervene and prevent institutionalisation from happening. Open the Gates project in Indonesia, implemented by Yakum and PJS, are supporting transitions of people out of institutions. Access to justice to be able to report on violence and abuse that are happening within institutions and outside are also really critical enablers for getting visibility and reparations for trauma and abuse that are happening to people with psychosocial disabilities. Inclusive policies and services through mobilising things like community-based inclusive development models are really critical, and they do work. So where all of these enablers exist, community participation becomes real. And the CRPD is clear. The right to live independently and be included in the community depends on a set of preconditions. These include non-discrimination, so the removal of those legal barriers that we talked about before, having accessibility, assistive technology, access to support services, social protection that doesn't discriminate against people with psychosocial intellectual disabilities, and community-based inclusive development. When these are absent, institutionalisation persists. People remain institutionalised because mainstream systems, social protection, housing, employment, healthcare, are not accessible, and they're still coercive, and continue to perceive disability through an ableist and institutional lens. So this brings us to development cooperation, and donor funding can unintentionally sustain institutional models. And this happens when we don't set human rights as the foundation for service planning and funding delivery from the outset. When funds are used to renovate or expand institutional facilities instead of prioritising community systems building. When they contract services that reinforce provider control, or when deinstitutionalisation is treated as a short-term project rather than a systems transformation. So what should donors do differently? Pranami's talked about some of these already, but firstly, we need to stop funding anything that segregates people from the community or controls them on the basis of their disability. Second, there needs to be embedded safeguards in all investments, so funding can't create or sustain institutions. And thirdly, and most importantly, we need to shift funding toward community-based systems, including things like personal assistance and peer support, housing, non-coercive crisis support, implementing the supported decision-making models that are increasingly being included in laws but are not implemented in practice. Inclusive gender-based violence and SRH, sexual and reproductive health services, are really critical. Family support and legal reform and policy development. Deinstitutionalisation isn't a project cycle. It really requires structural shifts. And this can feel overwhelming, but it can be phased. It can start with policy dialogue and stopping new admissions into institutions. It can be investing in community supports and then supporting the transitions over time. The primary responsibility for deinstitutionalisation does lie with states. Under the CRPD, it's not a policy choice, it's a legal obligation, and states must reallocate resources away from institutional settings and toward those community-based supports that we've been talking about. But donor funding can support this transition, and the transition can be guided by clear national planning processes. Having time-bound roadmaps are really critical. Governments and donors can be working together to establish long-term financing frameworks that can support this process. Without this level of planning and resourcing, deinstitutionalisation risks being aspirational or staying aspirational, or it can lead to new forms of institutionalisation. So in terms of what rights-based community support looks like in practice, it's really about having a person-centred approach driven by the will and preferences of people with disabilities, not by providers. It's non-coercive. It's based on consent. It's replacing forced sterilisation and treatment and substituted decision-making with supported decision-making. And it's multidimensional. So we're talking about housing, income, health, relationships, participation, gender norms, not just clinical care. And it's got to be embedded in communities, the peer networks, family and community support, local systems and services. And it's relational, it's about belonging. I'm really keen to see application of peace-building theory and action to strengthen the work that's happening, because it's core. Deinstitutionalisation is about fostering restorative relationships, trust and social cohesion. So between individuals and their families, between people in systems and communities that have excluded them, and within communities where fear and stigma and misunderstanding have taken hold. It really pushes us to think about how we address conflict and resistance in ways that are non-coercive and rights-based, and highlights the importance of engaging local leadership, creating dialogue, and having that collective problem-solving space with communities. These things are already happening. We see practical examples everywhere. What we need is scale. So across the Asia-Pacific region in particular, deinstitutionalisation is being driven by OPDs and those grassroots activists with disabilities. And we cannot succeed without them. They are central. And we have already heard today from TCI and PSA, they're working really hard to challenge discriminatory laws. They're supporting people to leave institutions. They're building community alternatives, and they're generating evidence and advocacy. But they're doing this with very limited funding, under extremely difficult conditions, and frequently at their own expense, and often without the recognition as equal partners. So the question for donors is not whether to engage, but how to resource and shift power to them. And this means providing core, flexible, multi-year funding, allowing for resourcing of informal networks, OPDs and informal networks, recognising the role that OPDs and these networks are playing as frontline workers, and engaging OPDs in leading design, monitoring and an evaluation of programs, not just in consultation. We need investment in movement strengthening and knowledge and evidence gathering to help support the scaling of these models that they're developing. We really need to recognise lived experience as expertise. So 20 years after the CRPD, we know what needs to change. Deinstitutionalisation requires shifting power, building inclusive systems and resourcing communities, and ensuring that people with disabilities can make their own choices, live with dignity and without the threat of inhumane and degrading treatment, and live as equal members of their communities. We have the evidence, we have the models, and we have leadership. What we need now is alignment of funding, of policy, and of political will. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you, Alicia. Your contribution helps connect the rights-based framework to the practical systems that must exist in the community support services, accessible mainstream systems, social protection, peer support, and safeguards in funding and program design. We've heard from lived experience, from global systems advocacy, and from evidence and development practice. I would now like to turn to the role of government and international cooperation, including how Australia contribute to moving this agenda forward in partnership with OPDs, Organisations of Persons with Disabilities, and regional actors. Our final speaker is Shelley from the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT. Government and development cooperation have a critical role in this agenda, not only through policy commitments, but through what gets funded, what gets measured, what safeguards are applied, and how rights holders' leadership is resourced. I invite Shelley to reflect on Australia's role in supporting disability equity and rights internationally, and the opportunities to advance community-based systems and end segregation through partnership with OPDs, civil society, governments, and regional actors. Shelley, go for it.
Thank you, Tim. Is the audio okay?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, or wherever you're joining from, but welcome, and thank you for your time today. A massive thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this incredibly important discussion with you all. I'd like to begin first by acknowledging the organisers, AFDO, ADDC, CBM Australia, and TCI Global, and to also thank my fellow panellists that spoke before, especially thank them for their expertise, their decades of hard work and experience. I wish to acknowledge too the lived experience that's here today with us, often underpinned by trauma, and the leadership that everyone is showing as well, which rightly sits at the centre of this conversation. So some people may have joined the TCI co-sponsored event yesterday on centering youth, women and gender diverse communities of persons with psychosocial disabilities in the deinstitutionalisation agenda. And some of my remarks may be similar, and I frame them in a similar way to say that deinstitutionalisation is both an important and at times a very challenging issue to discuss. For governments, it speaks to the gap we are often navigating between our commitments under the Convention and the realities of implementation on the ground. It's not an easy conversation, but it's one we have to continue. For many people with disabilities, particularly young people, women, gender diverse individuals with psychosocial or intellectual disabilities, these challenges are a part of daily life and we owe it to them. As policymakers, decision makers, advisors, and donor partners, we have a responsibility to engage openly, to listen, and to learn from lived experience, and to do better. So this is essential if we are to continue improving, strengthening systems, upholding rights, and working towards better life outcomes for all people with disabilities. So 20 years on from the adoption of the CRPD, we are reminded that while the Convention established a clear and transformative vision, deinstitutionalisation remains a very unfinished agenda. As we have heard, this is not simply about closing institutions, as many have said before. It's about transforming the entire system, the laws, the policies, the funding models, and community attitudes especially, so that people with disabilities can exercise their rights fully, including the right to live independently and be included in their communities. Australia's international engagement in this space is guided by our International Disability Equity and Rights Strategy, which we refer to as IDEAs. This strategy reflects extensive consultation with persons with disabilities and their representative organisations, including those most marginalised, and it places disability equity and rights at the centre of our development and humanitarian engagement. DFAT established an external reference group for this process to guide us and hold us to account, and I wish to acknowledge the contributions of the late Dr. Bhargavi Dava, the Executive Director of TC Global, who I was privileged to spend time with in 2019. Through these consultations, we heard consistently that deinstitutionalisation, community inclusion, and the preconditions for inclusion must go hand in hand, supported by access to services, assistive technology, non-discrimination, and social protection. We also heard a strong call for governments and donors to prioritise community-based approaches, to invest in organisations of persons with disabilities, and align laws and policies with the CRPD. These insights directly shape the strategy, which have directly shaped how we spend our money going forward. We published a summary of these consultations on ideas in a report called Voices from the Region, which is available on our website with an easy read version. At its core, our ideas strategy commits Australia to supporting a future where people with disabilities are valued members of their communities with equal rights, dignity, and the supports they need to participate fully. Australia views its role as both a development partner and a catalyst for change. We recognise that deinstitutionalisation is complex and it requires sustained investment, system reform, and careful attention to risks, including the risk that exclusion is reproduced in new forms if reforms are not rights-based, as both Tim and Alicia have mentioned before. Central to our approach is support for locally led, rights-based efforts. Deinstitutionalisation must be shaped and led by persons with disabilities and their representative organisations. So Australia designed and supported our new initiative called Stronger Movements, Stronger Futures, which places OPDs at the centre and strengthens leadership and advocacy within the disability rights movement. A significant portion of our funding is going direct to OPDs as core funding, flexible core funding, which we're proud of, so that OPDs can set their own strategic agendas and priorities and go ahead and implement them, and acknowledges their leadership. So Australia's been a proud supporter of TCI, and I remember the excitement when they were formalised as an organisation. Australia's support for TCI included the establishment of a communities of practice on deinstitutionalisation. So this communities of practice helped to enable peer learning, share evidence, and coordinate advocacy across the region. These efforts reflect the importance of locally led, culturally grounded, and sustainable change. We also recognise that community inclusion does not happen automatically. It depends on the support. It depends on the presence of the enabling systems and supports. So Australia contributes to these foundations through partnerships such as AT-Scale, the Global Partnership for Assistive Technologies, recognising the essential role of assistive products in supporting independence and participation for some people. We also fund Partnerships for Social Protection, which is one of our bigger partnerships across the region, which is investing in social protection systems in many countries in which we work, and particularly for families and individuals with disability. We also partner with the Global Disability Fund to strengthen disability inclusion across development systems and ensure resources reach the most marginalised. Alongside this, we are also supporting research, policy development, and knowledge sharing to strengthen the evidence base for deinstitutionalisation and inclusive development. This includes work on support services and psychosocial disability and broader efforts to capture and share learning across the sector. We are also continuing to always strengthen safeguards in our development programs, guided by a do no harm approach, to ensure that our investments do not inadvertently reinforce institutional or segregated models. At the same time, we must be honest about the challenges that remain. Despite global commitments, institutionalisation continues to shape the lives of far too many people. In many contexts, institutional care is a bit of an oxymoron, isn't it? But institutional care remains the default, while community-based alternatives are limited to or under-resourced. So people with psychosocial disabilities in particular remain among the most marginalised, as we all know. They are facing stigma, exclusion, and denial of their rights, including legal capacity and participation in decision-making. I acknowledge Pranami's closing statements that donors and development partners need to stop funding institutions and segregated models. In some partner countries, in the past, Australia has provided support to institutions, not to reinforce institutionalisation, but to help improve the living conditions of those within them, which, once we see, are heartbreaking and we cannot do nothing at the time. But whilst we do this, in these situations where the community-based alternatives are limited, we are spending far more resources and effort working with the government to fundamentally change the system at the same time at a far greater rate than we're spending on the institutions themselves. So I offer this example to acknowledge the complexity of the environments in which we operate. Our aim is to act responsibly, and pragmatically in supporting people with disabilities, addressing immediate needs whilst continuing to allocate for greater funding towards longer-term rights-based approaches and community and sustainable alternatives. One thing I've learnt working in DFAT in our region for close to 15 years is we're not afraid to do hard things and to grapple with complex issues and authentically listen and to try and do better, which is why I'm here today. And I have seen a funding shift. I have seen our funding shift in line with the CRPD. and sustainable change occurring. I could have given you a shiny speech, which didn't acknowledge the realities as a donor of how sometimes we do work. But Australia, we want to be seen as a consistent, credible partner in this space, and I believe we have been since 2008. And so we are authentic when we come here to listen, and authentically trying to shift, always try to do better and to shift our funding into to better ways that are human rights compliant. And one thing that this can be clearly seen in how we have worked with OPDs over the years since 2008 and our new Stronger Movements, Stronger Futures investment. So like it has been said today, international cooperation does have a critical role to play in this transformation. It includes ensuring that financing supports community-based systems rather than segregation, and that investments prioritise the services and supports required for meaningful inclusion. It also means strengthening partnerships with organisations of persons with disabilities, not only as contributors to the dialogue, but obviously as leaders, implementers and monitors of the reform. There is also a need to continue aligning legal and policy frameworks with the CRPD, including advancing legal capacity, supported decision-making and the right to live independently and be included in communities. At the same time, stronger accountability mechanisms are needed so that progress can be measured, not only in commitments, but in actual tangible improvements in people's lives. So ultimately, the question we must ask is whether people with disabilities, particularly the most marginalised, are experiencing greater autonomy, inclusion and dignity in their daily lives. As we reflect on 20 years of the CRPD, we are reminded that the Convention is not only a statement of principles, but a roadmap for action. The challenge before all of us is to close the gap between rights on paper and rights in practice, which I know many of you work in your day-to-day lives to do. For deinstitutionalisation, this requires transforming systems, investing in these community-based supports, and ensuring that persons with disabilities lead the way. Australia remains committed to working in partnership with governments, civil society and organisations of persons with disabilities across the Indo-Pacific and our region and globally to advance this agenda. Thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you, Shelley, for providing such a comprehensive lens of government funding, policy, and a substantive history of practice within Australia's development programs related to deinstitutionalisation. So given the time, we're going to go straight to questions. And unfortunately, Shelley has to leave a little bit early. So we're actually going to go to Shelley's question first, which I think you should be able to see my screen, but I'll read it out for accessibility. The question for Shelley is, how can Australia use diplomacy and development cooperation to support regional leadership on ending segregation? 2 minutes, Shelley, or less.
Thanks, Tim. I feel like Pranami and Alicia gave a really good roadmap to answer this question as it is, and I look forward to having a transcript of this afterwards so that I can take it back into the department and discuss more with people. But yeah, thank you, Tim. Thank you for the question. So as I've already mentioned, we believe that ending segregation requires sustained system-wide transformation, and it must be led by partner governments themselves. So international cooperation plays a supporting and an enabling role within that. So through our diplomatic engagement, Australia works with partner governments across the Indo-Pacific to advance ratification and effective implementation of the CRPD. This includes supporting the development and strengthening of legislative frameworks, national action plans, and inclusive strategies that align with CRPD obligations, particularly the right to live independently in the community. These efforts are complemented by a strong focus on public financial management and national budgeting processes, which we work with a lot of governments on. So we recognise that commitments to deinstitutionalisation must be underpinned by sustainable financing to fund services and to fund social protection. So therefore, we partner with governments who are sovereign to help align their budgetary frameworks with reform priorities, supporting a gradual reorientation of their resources away from institutional models and towards community-based services and supports. Through development cooperation, including where appropriate budget support, which is a big way in which we partner with our partner governments in the region, it includes influencing budget support. So to contribute to broader systems reform. So we strengthen inclusive service delivery across health, education and social protection, and invest in the foundations of community inclusion, particularly accessible community-based services that enable people with disabilities to exercise choice and control. It also means funding NGOs and civil society so that they too can advocate, keep governments to account, and provide the services which they wish to do. At the same time, we recognise that strong and independent civil society, as I've just mentioned, is essential for lasting change. So we provide core flexible funding to organisations of persons with disabilities, to many civil society organisations and to NGOs, as we recognise their central role in advocacy, service delivery and supports, and their contribution to democratic accountability. So these actors ensure that reform processes are informed by lived experience and that governments are supported and held to account in delivering on commitments. We also support knowledge sharing and evidence building across the region through communities of practice, which I mentioned, research partnerships and south-to-south collaboration, so that countries can learn from each other about what works and they can scale it. So our goal is always to stand alongside partners, amplifying local leadership, listening deeply and supporting long-term system-wide transformation. Apologies. Our approach is guided by partnership. So we support regional, locally led solutions, peer learning, and reinforce accountability with the shared objective of transforming from segregated systems to inclusive societies, grounded in dignity, rights, and full participation. So thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. And Shelley has to get to another engagement. So thank you so much for your generosity, Shelley, and really appreciate your contributions to the discussion here today.
I'm sorry to run before the audience has a chance to offer questions, and I promise you it's not on purpose, but it's a very packed week here at COSP. And so, yeah, thank you for your grace. And Tim, thank you for your beautiful facilitation of this session as well, and to everyone as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Shelley. So we'll next go to a question for Ameza and Sarah from PSA Fiji around what should governments and development partners learn from peer-led and OPD, so organisations of persons with disability-led support models. Ameza and Sarah, 2 minutes ideally, if you can. Just checking. Can you hear me, Ameza?
Peer-led and OPD support models. We as persons with psychosocial disability, with our lived experience, are the experts in our fields. We understand when we are localizing laws of each country to CRPD, actually what it means in our daily lives. How do we make it in that way that it is more effective? And I think so. Another thing that we were talking about earlier, Sarah and I, was for supporting partners, how they can help PSA with this work is we had a project with MMT. When they came in, they said they put our office in order. So our policies were aligned, and so same thing when our partners are, even the partners that are here right now, when they are speaking, they also going to their donor, to their, what do you call that? When they are speaking to people that they are supporting, they also say what our rights look like to each, that they are aware of, to bring awareness to these places wherever they are going. Like the places for CBM, they support a couple of different organizations.
Thanks,
so it's
Sarah.
like a MOU kind. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah and Ameza. Thank you for your contributions there. We will move on to a question for Pranami on how can states identify when community-based services are actually reproducing
No, it's
institutional
okay. You
control?
will win. What else?
Thank you for the
Pranami.
question. It's a tough one, and I'm going to tell you what I think about it. I'm going to keep it short. It's really, really hard for states to identify what's happening, what kind of violations are happening within the community. It's very, very difficult to find out what's happening behind closed doors, whether in the institutions or in homes. And this is where I think it's important to leverage the integrity of organizations of persons with disabilities. When we have OPDs and peer support networks of persons with psychosocial disabilities within the community, and when they have access and when interactions are facilitated through programs or interventions or initiatives that have been designed by the OPDs themselves, then there's a greater chance of being able to access information related to the kind of violations that are happening. So I feel that OPDs need to be very involved in both the design of initiatives and programs of community inclusion, as well as the monitoring and evaluation. Because again, it's people who know what these violations look like who can help identify it, even when they're hidden behind a smile or behind silence. So that's my answer.
Thanks, Pranami. We'll now move on to a question for Alicia from CBM Australia on what practical steps can program implementation partners take to align programming with CRPD, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, compliant deinstitutionalisation. Alicia, 2-minute response, if possible, please.
Thanks, Tim. Building on what Pranami was just saying, I think that having those do no harm screens within programs are absolutely essential. Institutionalisation and controlling systems can be very insidious, and you really need to have technical skill and lived experience to be able to identify when a program might be unintentionally contributing to funding or indirectly sustaining institutional approaches. And so you really need to be working really closely with OPDs of people with psychosocial disabilities to understand what those violations could be and where the risks in the program could be. We've said it many times already, but shifting funding towards community-based supports is absolutely essential. And situating OPDs in leadership of those models is really critical. When you're thinking about programs, are your monitoring frameworks, do they include indicators that track things like choice and control, community inclusion, and reductions in institutionalisation? Having those central in monitoring frameworks for social change programs are absolutely critical, and so needing to move beyond just service focus, but also to building and addressing the systems change that Pranami was talking about. We really need to make sure that there is investment in training of service providers, policymakers on what rights look like for people with psychosocial disabilities. And that includes mainstream OPDs who might not have a specific focus on psychosocial disability yet. The investment in really strong capacity building initiatives like the Quality Rights projects can help provide that foundation for understanding what violations look like and help them to see where their program can be working towards influencing legal frameworks, influencing community systems to eliminate coercive approaches to care in the community. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Alicia. Thank you. Unfortunately, due to the limitations of the UN timetable of 1 hour and 15 minutes for a side event, we won't be able to fit in questions from the audience. I do apologize. I will note that we are planning on possibly running a reinvention of this event later on in the year, as a webinar for the Australian Disability Development Consortium, and we'll run that with a bit more time so that we make sure that we can have questions from the audience. So I'll go to wrapping up. So thank you to all of our speakers and to everyone who has joined the discussion. Across the session, I've heard 5 key messages. First, deinstitutionalisation remains unfinished 20 years after the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was adopted, the UN CRPD. Second, it is not only about closing buildings, it is about transforming the laws, services, funding models and attitudes that deny people choice and control. Third, people with psychosocial, intellectual and cognitive disabilities must lead the design, implementation and monitoring of reforms. Fourth, community inclusion requires real support, peer support, personal assistance, accessible mainstream services, social protection and safeguards against coercion. Fifth, governments and development partners have a responsibility to fund inclusion, not segregation. The next phase of CRPD, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability implementation, must be measured not only by commitments made in international forums, but by whether people can live safely, freely, and with dignity in the community, with the support they choose. Thank you again to AFDO, ADDC, PSA Fiji, TCI Global, CBM Australia, DFAT, the organisers, our sign language interpreters and audience members. We hope this discussion contributes to stronger action on deinstitutionalisation and community-based inclusion across the region and globally. Thank you so much for your time today. And that is a wrap of the event.
Thanks, Tim.